Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Kathryn King toko ingoa. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's terribly exciting for me to be out of New Zealand. I was there for 4 years without leaving, and will go back very inspired by all the amazing things that I'm seeing here. So at Waka Kotahi, we have a vision for Althea Row of a land transport system connecting people, products and places for a thriving Aotearoa. And as you can imagine, for Waka Kotahi, our New Zealand transport agency, this is a pretty seismic shift from what we were focusing on for many decades. A real singular focus that we had on building and maintaining our state highway system. So today I'm going to take you back through a trajectory that we've been on to shift our focus and explain why opening up our streets for people is really critical to achieving the values that are so important to our communities. Did that move? Yep, wonderful. So in the past decade, we've seen a really significant increase in the amount of investment in urban mobility in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Included in that is a really big shift in the number of people working on these projects and an increase in capability amongst people across the sector. We've seen a shift from around 50 million that we were investing about a decade or so ago to over $1 billion in the portfolio that I oversee today. So this investment reflects the many benefits that we're seeing in opening up open air travel for society. Things like children being able to roam around their neighbourhoods independently. The many health benefits we see from people moving more around their local neighbourhoods, and the economic benefits of more people being able to access the places they need to go. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is create nicer places for people to live. In cities across Aotearoa, in the past decade, we've had investment that has led to some really well-cherished and flagship parts of our cycleway network. This is helping communities across the country meet their needs and people get to where they need to go. And we've also enjoyed really enormous success with our great rides network, which focuses on off-road paths in quite spectacular places across the country that have really turned around the economic prosperity across small towns in New Zealand. We also have a commitment to include access for people walking and cycling alongside other big transport upgrades like motorways or railways across the country. And this is providing cities in Aotearoa with some really useful long-distance sections of networks. But it hasn't been easy. We've certainly had resistance in communities across the country. We've had our examples of bulldozers out shifting cycleways overnight, sledgehammers taking out many of our projects. And we're seeing up to 10 years for a single project to be completed. Some sections are now costing upwards of $15 to $20 million a kilometre. So when we start to enter this new era of a emission reduction plan, a climate crisis, adding to the other crises we're facing in New Zealand of safety, of health, we really need to start to think about how we do things differently. We've committed to an emission reduction pathway that sets us some pretty big challenges, some big targets for transport, which really needs to do the heavy lifting in emission reduction in the next decade. We're looking to reduce the amount of driving that people are doing by 20% by 2035. The plan includes a new national plan for walking and a plan for cycling that set out how we're going to deliver a step change in walking and cycling numbers. These plans really represent a fundamental shift in the way we're going to plan and fund walking and cycling projects across the country, which focus primarily on repurposing existing street space. And as you can see, this 20% reduction is going to be a really significant challenge for cities across New Zealand. We are very, very car dependent. For decades, we have invested in beautiful roads, a very comprehensive state highway system, houses that are further and further from centres, and really expansive amounts of car parking. So we have a system that's made it really, really easy to drive. And so most trips are driven, even those that are very, very short. Over 65% of journeys made all across the country are under 5 kilometres, and the vast majority of these are driven. And whilst we've spent decades really worrying about peak hour congestion, about travel time savings, smoothing traffic flow, we now need to think about all trips. And this means making sure that walking, cycling and public transport are the most comfortable ways for people to travel, particularly around local neighbourhoods. Making sure that we open up our streets to everyone, so people from children to older adults, and particularly women who tend to make more trips, more of the household trips, local trips, feel really safe walking, scootering, cycling around their local neighbourhoods. So that we know that for people to want to change, we need to offer them safe, accessible, connected routes to the places that they go the most often. And this needs to be much easier than driving. For a long time, however, we have delivered projects that consisted of just one route or just a part of a route as we chipped away at connecting up our networks over time. This really meant that we were having the same arguments over and over, street by street, block by block. But our goal with emission reduction is to connect up our urban networks within the next decade. And this means focusing on connectivity as our main priority. And it also means that we're going to need some new tools in our toolkit. But first I'd like to tell you about our success story in Althea Row. Kotahi Christchurch has been investing in their cycling network now since the earthquake just over a decade ago. They kicked off with a network of connected main routes into the city centre, and they're almost all finished now. The next step for them is going to be unlocking their local streets for people to make shorter local journeys and connect to those main streets. And it's really paying off. In the last year alone, they've seen a 40% increase in people riding on those routes. And on their completed routes, they're seeing almost 50% of people riding are women. They've got the highest mode share for cycling in New Zealand, and the schools on these routes have seen children riding to school increase from around 5% pre-investment to around 50% today. But across the rest of the country, there is still a lot of work to do. Only 17% of urban networks across the country are complete. And if we carry on at the rate we're going, it's going to be many, many generations before everyone can get where they need to go easily. So we need ways to enjoy those benefits of streets that are open to people much faster. And there's nothing like having a child to bring some urgency into your life. Of course, we want to be good stewards for our children, but we also want them to enjoy the freedom of roaming around their neighbourhoods right now. This is my son, Lucian, and in lockdown in New Zealand, we had extremely car-free streets in our strict lockdowns, and he loved hooning around the neighbourhood on his bike. He was the king of the road. But with traffic back in force now, he wants to continue to explore the neighbourhood by himself, and as you can imagine, that fills me with dread. But in the Netherlands, 80% of 11-year-olds can travel around their local neighbourhoods by themselves. And I had great hope for my son when 4 years ago a project was proposed down the main street near where we live that would enable him to get up to his intermediate school safely by bike. 4 years on, there's one more year before he heads to intermediate school, and they're still doing the business case on that project. So I'm losing hope with that one. But there's a massive change underway to the way that people travel, and huge potential in New Zealand for micromobility. We've done quite a bit of modelling around what micromobility might mean for us, and we can see that potentially, if we can open up our streets, we could see a fourfold increase in the amount of trips being made by micromobility by 2030. And those changes are already happening in our system. People are purchasing micromobility vehicles in droves across the country. In fact, more New Zealanders are purchasing e-bikes, e-scooters, e-skateboards than they are electric cars. And on our best cycle routes in Auckland, around 50% of people riding them are on electric bikes. Our research shows that these new electric bikes particularly have the greatest potential for replacing car trips. We know that they have the potential for carrying children, carrying people shopping, doing the sort of car-like journeys that really are going to make a difference in our emission reduction plan. And they also have the potential for making the biggest benefit for women who tend to do more of those household trips. And people riding these bikes are enjoying it significantly more than people driving. Our research shows that driving tends to negatively impact our mental health, while riding e-bikes makes us happy. So we need our streets to keep up with the transformational change that's underway with how people are travelling. Put simply, we need protected networks of cycleways and slower streets much faster. And change is underway with our speed management plans. We're seeing rapid rollouts of lower speeds across the country, and particularly around schools, where we have a target to have all schools across the country in urban areas with a 30-kilometre speed limit around the walkable, cyclable catchment of the school by 2027. Now, around the world, and we've heard a little bit about it this morning, that picture's gone a bit funny, we have seen rapid transformation of streets during the COVID pandemic. In fact, it's one of the biggest legacies that we've seen from COVID, is cities around the world opening up their streets to enable open-air travel. And we have some experience of this transitional planning in Althea Row. Quay Street runs along Auckland's waterfront and was once a really car-dominated street separating people from the waterfront. A few years ago, we were able to reclaim some of the car parking space so Aucklanders could enjoy the benefits of more space for riding much faster. And in the time of the temporary cycleway being in place, we saw the number of people riding along there rise to 2,000 a day. And now, with the more permanent change in place, it's a really pleasant place to ride along the waterfront. But let's not wait through the years that we spend designing these beautiful schemes. Let's open up our streets to everyone right now. So we have a program and a real focus in Waka Kotahi in iterative programming. How do we start to make small changes that pick up the pace of change, build momentum for change over time? In 2019, just before the pandemic, we had a look around the world at what other countries were doing to really shift the momentum for change in their cities. We saw a lot of these trials and tests happening and really successfully building community support for change. So we initially, in 2019, helped 6 projects across the country and used that time to understand what was working, what wasn't working, what we might need to change to enable more of these projects. And then in 2020, we launched our first national program of tactical urbanism. We provided councils across the country with funding to just give it a go, see what happened. We funded 90% of the cost of the projects so that we could own some of that risk for councils. We invested in over 70 projects across the country, and 3/4 of those are transitioning on to permanent changes. We learnt a lot about the level of capability in doing these sorts of street changes and where we needed to change our processes to make it much easier for councils. We learnt how important good engagement is, literally going door to door, having lots of cups of tea. And we learnt an awful lot about what people don't like. We know orange is particularly offensive to people in Althea Row. They associate that with disruption and roadworks. We know that aesthetics do matter to people. They want their local place to feel cherished and looked after. They wanted changes that represented their local community. And we learnt how important having a plan for adapting things is, the tweaking, the many, many little changes that we need to make to get things right for communities. We saw streets transformed and businesses gaining confidence to ask for open air seating rather than car parking. We saw business takings increase in town centres across the country. We saw communities enjoying the benefits of lower speeds and lower traffic volumes, and this enabled communities to connect, for kids to play outside. Our focus is now on scaling up. We started with these initial experiments. It helped us to understand what we needed to do to improve our practice, and that's being refined into 2 new programs that we've launched this year. But first, we needed to reduce some barriers. We needed to make sure we weren't getting in the way of good progress. We learnt that communities found it really, really hard to shut streets. And most of the difficulty sat with rules that we had made. So we changed our rules to enable local communities to shut their own streets without any form of formal traffic management. We learnt that there's no legal framework for doing trials, so we're building a new piece of legislation that will give councils firm legal grounding for doing their trials. And we learnt that lengthy consultations and the legal requirements for those are really the death knell for a good project. So we are updating our legislation to reduce the onerous burden that we put on councils for consultation on things that we really want to see happen. Things like cycleways, bus stops, filters, shutting streets. And we made a big change to our traffic control device manual. We have changed the manual to enable councils to paint their streets so that their streets represent their communities. And our evidence of the first few of these projects is that the paint, just the paint on its own, is slowing traffic and making people feel safer in the streets. So that has led to our next iteration called Streets for People. We've reduced the number of councils that we're working with so we can build better relationships with them. We've given them more time to change their processes and get themselves ready for the program. And we've given them more time to build relationships with local communities. We're again funding 90% of the cost of the projects, reducing the risk to councils, and heavily investing in the lessons that we can capture from the program. Hoping it will just go. Oh. Does anyone know how to make the video go? Oh.
Imagine an Aotearoa New Zealand with streets where children can bike, walk or scooter on their own, where communities come together and share experiences in welcoming spaces, where engine noise and tyre roar gives way to birdsong. In 2020 and 21, councils across Aotearoa New Zealand tested different low-cost street layouts to help people get around more easily and make town centres more inviting. Innovating Streets was our first group of projects with local government. We learned a lot, and where the trials worked well, we saw great results, like safer streets with fewer vehicles, people driving at slower speeds, more people biking, walking and scootering, safer and more accessible areas, and more people enjoying public spaces. Streets for People builds on those great results and on what we've learned from Innovating Streets, making it easier and faster to create safer, more people-friendly streets across Aotearoa New Zealand.
We'll be working with a smaller cohort of councils so that we can partner with local communities more easily to test out safer connections and more welcoming spaces. It'll let people across Aotearoa enjoy the immediate benefits of low-cost interim changes ahead of working through those longer-term solutions.
Streets for People is one way we're delivering a healthier and safer future for everyone.
The transport sector has ambitious targets for Aotearoa New Zealand's emission reduction plan. So we're working on a number of initiatives to support better travel choices. Streets for People is one of them, an incredible opportunity to think about our streets differently so we can speed up our response to the climate emergency.
Streets for People is our chance to move towards a low emission and climate resilient future.
By opening our streets to everyone, we can reduce our emissions, make it safer and easier for people to move around, and improve the physical and mental well-being of our communities. It's the smart thing to do, and it's the right thing to do.
And to do it, we need to work together.
There we go. So next up in our portfolio is a program called Transport Choices. This is a $350 million Crown fund that's focused on quick changes. So whereas Streets for People is about transforming local streets in partnership with local communities, this program is about taking standard interventions, the things that we all know how to do well, like crossings, bus stops, cycleways, and rolling them out at pace and scale so that we can give people better travel options much faster. It's funded by our Climate Emergency Response Fund, so reflecting the urgency of that work. We're also partnering with businesses through our Innovation Fund to help them trial new services. This is a partnership based on a do-learn-do approach, making it safer for them to fail fast, learn from their mistakes so we can more quickly get to the solutions that our communities need. It includes things like mobility hubs and this bike subscription service. And we're looking at trialling new forms of partnership with businesses like bike parking providers, big street bikers, where we're supporting them with capital funds to roll out a bike parking network across the country, and their advertising will then pay for ongoing maintenance. And we have some trials of e-bikes occurring across the country, helping us to understand how we can make e-bikes more affordable to the people who need them the most. These focus on our Māori and Pasifika communities who carry really the greatest burden of our transport system. They pay the largest percentage of their household income on transport. They have poor health outcomes, and e-bikes really have the potential to change lives, to reduce costs, to make people healthier. So we have this vision of a more connected Aotearoa where people thrive, but I think we have to remember we were once a nation where people walked and cycled most of their journeys, where we had a really great public transport network. Everyone was able to access the places they needed to go, and streets supported community life. In fact, we may look back on these decades of car dependency as just a blip. But we need innovative ways to help us enjoy the streets that meet our needs as quickly as possible. And this is the journey that we're on at Waka Kotahi. And I've got 30 seconds for questions.